from I Am Interchange. This is the Hatch podcast series. As we approach 2026, marking the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States, we find ourselves at a critical inflection point of our democracy. The promise of equity demands that every policy and investment provide significant, sustained support to those most in need. This support must act as a bridge to creating an equitable economy, fostering an inclusive and compassionate society, and strengthening an accountable democracy. In this pivotal moment, we must ensure that our collective efforts address systemic inequalities, amplify marginalized voices, and create pathways for all individuals to thrive. Only by prioritizing these goals can we fulfill the foundational ideals of our nation and build a more just and resilient future. To that end, we are in need of a revolution of the soul. We're in Arco Santi, Arizona this week. Founded by Italian architect Paolo Soleri, who studied under Frank Lloyd Wright. His vision for the future arcology was to put community at the center, supporting environmentally integrated, resilient, and equitable urban communities. Attendees of Hatch's Spring Summit spent a week at Arco Santi's outside-the-box environs in education and ethos, with Ignite talks, workshops, panel discussions, and performances exploring democracy and its impact on sustainable development and the arc of equitable social evolution. Hatch brought together some of the country's leading experts and activists to home in on all that hinders and provides hope. I'm Tate Chamberlain, and in this podcast, I host distinguished author and Duke University history and public policy professor Nancy McLean, PolicyLink President and CEO Michael McAfee, and Represent Us co-founder and CEO Josh Lynn, in a discussion of the messy truths about democracy and getting things done. We've taken over the library in Arco Santi, Arizona. Join us, won't you? Welcome, everybody. This is the Hatch Podcast. We are in Arco Santi, Arizona, and we are with the Democracy Cohort. It's been an exciting week. We've got Nancy McLean, Michael McAfee, and Josh Lynn in the house. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
So glad to be here.
Glad to be here.
Will you tell me about your first memory of democracy?
I was on the student government as a sophomore in college when the movement to divest the university's investments from South Africa was active. And I was really moved and taught and inspired by that movement. And so became part of a team on the student government trying to make the case for the university divesting. And it provided me a real education in the value of democracy, but also the frustrations of democracy, and also the way that money and the hope of financial reward can skew things away from doing what is right, because of course the university investors wanted to have the most profitable investments and didn't want a bunch of kids telling them what they should and shouldn't invest in.
My first experiences with democracy had to do with how to protect oneself. Stories of my family around my grandfather being ran out of Mississippi because he struck a white man for not paying them after picking cotton. So that's a death sentence in Mississippi, so they settled in Benton Harbor, Michigan. My father always tucking his pistol under the seat of his car as we would drive to West Point, Mississippi in the summers to spend time with my grandmother, watching his energy change, how he would cower a little bit, wouldn't be as strong as I knew him to be because that was not safe. So in many ways, I learned early on strategies about how to survive as a Black person in this country. But while I saw that, I also saw family members who all served in the military as well. This is a crazy juxtaposition that you're trying to protect yourself from the very democracy that you're honored to serve in. And then I followed my dad right into the military and spent 8 years in the United States Army. And so I've learned how to be safe in this country, but I've also learned how to love it enough to want to make it better.
The first time I remember democracy really mattering to me, other than like a civics class or a government class, my best friend growing up was gay. We didn't know at the time. He may have known. I didn't know. And we went from high school to college. And when we got to college was around the time that marriage equality started to become a real hot political issue in this country. And it wasn't about me, but I remember seeing my best friend with his partner and hearing public officials who are elected to represent we the people standing up there saying, well, these kinds of people should have the rights to get married and all the benefits that go along with that. But those kind of people who love in a different way, they shouldn't. And there is an inhumanity in that, of course. But to hear it come not just from some uneducated person on the street, but from like a political operative who was doing it because they knew that it was politically savvy and it would help them get reelected, was a warning sign for me at the power of our democracy as it gets misused and bastardized. Thankfully, that movement is an example of what you can do with democracy and how organizing and power works and how we can win. And we look to that movement all the time as a model because they were so successful. And yet it was a hard-fought war. So a great example of how democracy can be so bad and also so beautiful.
We talked a little bit earlier, and you were describing that the country's at a ripe point to be finally teed up as an actual democracy. And Michael, you've described it as everyone seeing themselves as a founder of the country. What do we do to help people see themselves as those founders?
First, we have to remind them that even when this nation was founded, no one gave people authorization to found it. They took that authorization. We have that agency today, actually. I think we have more of it. And so I think some of it is a reminder. Some of it is reminding people that, democracies are always imperfect, and they're even going to be imperfect after we finish tinkering with it. And so we should not be so consumed with that it stops us from seeing our own majesty and the contributions that we can make in the moment that we're in now. So for me, it is about that reminder. It is about inviting people to step into their power. It is reminding them that, when you think about all the opportunities of social change in this country, they didn't come with people granting people permission. They took it. And to an earlier point of Nancy's around us standing on the shoulders of folks, our folks would be turning over in their graves, watching us with so much comfort, waiting for someone to give us permission to do something that is already ours to do if we want to do it.
As a historian, I have watched with pain, as have most historians in this country, regardless of what they study, these states like Florida that have adopted laws that essentially criminalize the honest teaching of American history, right? And people are fearful for their jobs if they talk about slavery, if they talk about our history. And it's just crazy. And it's also this notion of, it's so subjective that, if a child should feel uncomfortable and that child is totally coded as white, because of course, generations of African-American children have sat in school classes hearing a history that is not theirs, that they know is wrong, that discounts their perspectives, that discounts what their relatives endured. And, I've been, I kind of came on the heels of a generation after the Civil Rights Movement, and also that was a result of the GI Bill and the democratization of higher education, of people who are inventing whole new fields, African-American history, labor history, women's history, queer history, LGBT history of sexuality, all these things. And it's been so exciting to feel like finally we were getting a truly representative American history, right? Where everybody's stories mattered and everybody's stories were being delved into and honored and told. And now suddenly, we have this crazy backlash that also has involved cruelty. In Florida, their Moms for Liberty, when they have attacked school board meetings in some places, they've come with the armed Proud Boys, who are threatening school. So, I've just heard stories that would raise your hair. But one thing I will say too, and this goes back to the volcano, I don't know what the geological metaphor is, but the thing is, this stuff is not popular. It's been polled. More than 80% of parents hate the idea of book bans. They want their kids to learn about other experiences and other cultures. They know their kids are entering a diverse, world. They want them to be equipped, and they want everybody's, experiences to be recognized. So we know those book bans are unpopular. We know all this, educational gag orders are unpopular, but that's where we get into what's happened to our political system, right? Because if you've gerrymandered a state legislature enough that it's not accountable to its people, then you can do what you want.
Nancy, you brought up gerrymandering. I can't help but think of the chart that you showed us, the new alphabet of that. Gerrymandering's scary.
Yeah.
Scarymandering.
Scarymandering. Is that what you call it?
I didn't invent the term, but yeah, it's out there.
Michael, you described this as the last frontier of the equity movement.
Yes.
Tell me more about it.
When I talk about that operative word, in the equity definition is all being the fundamental word about people. The outcome that we're trying to create is a just and fair society. And if I feel like with climate, we're at a tipping point of either we're going to do this or we're not going to do it. When I talk about that 100 million in America living at 200% of poverty and describe that 50% of it is white, 50 million of it is white. The other half is people of color. That's a level of shared pain that we don't necessarily associate ourselves with, right? Like, I wonder if white America really knew that actually anti-Black racism has jumped host. The things that have been designed to harm me and my family now are harming middle class and upper middle class white folks. And so they're mad. They shouldn't be mad at Mexico. That's not actually who they should be mad at, immigrants. You know, when you think about it, you read a book like The Color of Law and you see what we've done in California. You know, if you live in the Bay, Oakland, San Francisco, let's just say, and you say you make $300,000, you feel poor. You feel poor if you have children because you can't afford the public education if you got to pay for it and pay for your rent or mortgage. But the reason why the public option isn't good anymore is because people didn't want to be educated next to people who look like me. So we abandoned it. And that's an example of where anti-Black racism is hiding in plain sight all across this country. And it's got people upset and angry and they don't even know why, right? They say it's the economy, but actually it's not the economy. It's the design of anti-Black racist laws and regulations that have been a cancer to our institutions. And they remain a cancer. But now they don't just, I've learned to live with them. My family has learned to live with them. White America now is having to figure out, can I live with this shit? Can I live with the toxic stress that it causes? Mm-hmm. And so that is why I talk about the outcome of a just and fair society. It's for everyone. And I think that this is the moment for us to get it. One, because there's enough shared pain.
Yeah.
We've never had such a beautiful multiracial coalition in America that is pushing back on this stuff. And so if we're not going to do it now, I don't know when we will do it, right? And so that's why I think this is a very hopeful moment for those two prerequisites, this flourishing, this multiracial coalition that we have, the shared pain that possibly can dislodge some very stuck ways of thinking, where people might actually say, you know what? I'm not going to have a problem being in solidarity with those Black and brown people now. If that breaks loose, we could actually get to what Nancy was saying about things holding us down. We break through that barrier, it's game on for us.
Can I ask you to go back for a second? Nancy and I looked at each other and smiled when you said, I don't think I got the quote quite, which is why I want you to say it again. You said something along the lines of the anti-Black laws have jumped host.
Yeah.
And I want you to talk about it more because I want to just acknowledge, as the white guy sitting here, it's hard to have racial conversations in this country. Mm-hmm. It takes bravery and trust and a lot of things. And if I were listening to this podcast and I had the opportunity to learn from you, what do you really mean when you say those policies have jumped host?
Nice.
Well, I think when you do harm to people, like, let's just say when folks brought us over here, they probably should have thought about what would happen if you bring so many of us over here that we become the majority in the nation, and when would that happen? These are real questions. Mm-hmm. They probably didn't worry about it because they wanted to maximize their profits right then, but they didn't think about, wow, we're going to be a nation of color now. Didn't think about that. Didn't think about, well, what if we design all of these laws to oppress people's right to vote, reproductive health, all these things, but we're doing it for those people. You never thought about, well, what keeps that from contaminating my family, especially when all of my family won't be able to buy their way out of the system. Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like, see, because we can't talk about race in this country, most people don't know that it is actually, that 100 million is by design. It's not random. It's not because there's a flaw with those people. That's what you hear in the newspaper. They're lazy. They're shiftless. That's not true. It's there because of design. And it is I would say it's a results-based design. It's been very effective. And what people are struggling with now in this country and they're angered about, while they may attack affirmative action, that's not what's causing them to be oppressed. You know, when I go to some places, I've said this a couple of places recently in Cincinnati, and it was a majority white group. And I said, you know, I don't know why you all are so angry, because you've gotten everything you've wanted. You got rid of your daddy's union. We didn't.
Yeah.
So what are you mad about? It wasn't black or brown folks that shipped all the jobs overseas. You said, let the market take care of things. Well, the market is taking care of them. You just thought it meant your ass, and it didn't. Right? And so when I say jump host, what I mean is people who believe that the economy is for them and it's not. You know, Trump's tax cuts helped me in my tax bracket. Didn't help my sisters or my mother, but it helped me. Yet my sister was going to vote for Trump. It's the craziness of it all. And there's a level of that, whatever you want to call it, that is out there where people don't really understand that there comes a point that when you keep doing harm, sooner or later, you cannot contain it.
Yeah.
You see this in the Republican Party. So much hate, so much vitriol that now they cannot put the genie back in the box. Well, that will happen to all of us if we're not careful. Mm-hmm. That's why I said last night, there's a lot that I'm going to fight against, but I don't want to become the thing that I'm fighting. And that's what I mean, that if you do not check our penchant to do harm, at some point, it's going to end up impacting your progeny.
I was just going to reflect that the thing I really appreciate about thinking of the scourge, of the poison, of the infection as having jumped host is that it allows us to have a conversation with people who are don't look like us, mm-hmm. but who are like us, who share a very common knowledge that the country's not working for me either. Mm-hmm. It's not working I didn't realize it wasn't working for you. It's not working for me, which is really different than saying it's not working for me because of you.
Yeah.
That's right.
And if we can get people to understand that that's not true, that it's actually not working because it's designed not to work. That's what brings me to this work of rebuilding our government, our democracy, is that it is one of the very few things in my life that I know I can go into a conversation and say, hey, do you love money in politics? And like, unless you're talking to a DC lobbyist, the answer is like, no, I don't. I think we should have merit and other more important values drive policy. And so I think there's a real opportunity for our nation to learn about how to have these conversations through the lens of building a better democracy, because it makes us able to communicate across difference in a really powerful way.
Mm-hmm. You know, we've talked about compassion at different points through these few days, and part of that compassion is realizing when someone's heart and their feet are moving in the right way, but their language may be stuck in the past somewhere, you know, and there is a tendency, I think, the performative piety that we sometimes see among progressive folks, you know, well, you didn't say that, right? Or you didn't give your pronouns, or you didn't do, you know, whatever the various things that, you know, people can do. And like that, there's a culture, there's something that we have to shed if we're going to come together. And that's to be, you know, we have to really be able to engage people's hearts, their lives, what they're going through, and worry less about, you know, kind of style and language and things like that if people are trying to move in the right direction. Somebody described this too as particularly dealing with, you know, not only young men, but young white men who have been radicalized to the alt-right. I had the privilege of being at a conference with Derek Black, who is the son of the person who runs the Daily Stormer podcast. David Duke, the Nazi, was his uncle. Incredible story. His book is actually coming out this summer, Klansman's Son. I keep giving pitches for books, but they're all so good. But there were people who protested him at his college, but there were also people who listened to him with empathy and challenged him. They didn't let him get away with anything. But that kind of thing, we need to create off-ramps, right, from these really toxic circles that are developing in our country. And so I think, you know, we don't have a lot of models of that, but you'd be surprised, you know, there are more than a few. So
that's right.
I hear about the coalition that is going to be needed to do this. And you talk about these toxic circles. Walk me through some of the first steps that can be taken to get in those doors and for them to take this movement seriously.
Well, there I would say, because oftentimes, you know, when I've been out speaking about my book, you know, people say, well, what about, you know, Fox News or, you know, my family members who are just, you know, they won't hear anything. They don't believe there's, you know, pandemic, you know, that there's a virus, you know, just all that kind of disinformation. And my advice actually is not to start with the hardest cases. You know, I think if we think about the concentric circles that we're part of. Each of us has a kind of penumbra around us of people who really care about what's happening. They're really disturbed, but they don't know what to do, And so I think really having conversations with people where they can identify how can they stretch themselves a bit, to do a bit more than they're doing, to give more. So, and kind of keep working those concentric circles. And then I think it will make it easier to penetrate some of those places. And also somebody like me can't do that work. There are people who have come from those movements. I actually met somebody else who was doing that work. And he was telling me about somebody who'd brought out over, I think, a 20-year period, like over 100 people. But that's not exactly at scale, right? And so even the guy who was reclaiming people from the ranks of the alt-right, neo-Nazis, et cetera, that's important work. But even he realized this is too retail, right? We've got to find another way at this problem. So I'm glad, going back to this point of a cosmic division of labor to reclaim democracy, I'm really glad that there are people who came out of that world who can speak to people who are in it, who know what the glue is. But I think for many of the people who will be listening to this podcast, it's probably more important to work in the circles of trust that you already have and the networks that you already have and think about the resources that you could commit.
I guess I'll just have one thing to say on this question of what is the coalition that it takes that we haven't talked about here yet. We often think about democracy as elections and voting. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that at this time, when so much of the country, especially young people, recognizes that elections and voting are not getting us the results that we want, there has to be something else. And so part of our work needs to be bringing the voting rights community and the election reform community and the democracy reform community and the culture of democracy community together as one. Because if we just continue to try to tell people, vote in the next election, the next person will be our savior, the next politician will fix everything. It's like we've tried that for how many decades now that we've been really aware of the problem. And I think it's giving people a sense of futility that is really damaging to our work. So to me, the power of our coalition can be, we have moral authority in PolicyLink. We have a playbook in Represent Us. We have other partners across this movement who are taking action in different ways, but we have to build the constellation. It can't just be a bunch of stars.
That's right.
I think, too, we have to think of democracy beyond elections. For example, look at what's happening among working people in America now. All the organizing that's going on in so many different, domains, from Starbucks to Amazon to, all these different places. And also, what's happened with the UAW, that exercise of collective power is giving the people who participated in that organizing and those strikes a sense of their personal efficacy, a sense of their connection to others across differences that they work with who are part of achieving these victories. And, again, as a historian, that's the progressive era was driven by so much organizing like that. The reinvention of democracy in the 1930s, there was the creation of the CIO, huge waves of strikes and sit downs. A lot of the people who came into the civil rights movement were veterans, were people who had been involved in that union organizing. So I think anything that makes people feel like their voice matters, and they can work with people adjacent to them in whatever the domain, including student government, right? I mean, all these places are spaces of democracy that we have to nurture and respect and look to. That's
right. One thing that we're doing that is more longer term is actually working with movement partners to create a governing standard for the nation. We actually don't have a standard of governing so that you could give it to everyday people and say, ask your city council, are they doing this? Are they doing that? Where are you causing harm? A way to look at the budget and say, do we actually really want 60% of our budget going to policing? Right? We don't have those tools that we're given to everyday people. Most people don't actually realize that the majority of the general operating budgets are going to policing in their cities. Imagine the conversation that they would have. You know why you don't have any money for those potholes and everything? It's for the police that don't ever come. And like in Oakland where I live, they never come. You call the police, it's going to be 8 hours later. But that means we don't have libraries enough. We don't have the potholes fixed. We don't have trash picked up. We don't have graffiti removed. We don't have basic city services provided, because we've accepted a police state without ever really asking the question, do we want a police state? And so our job now has to create a set of governing standards that allow people to ask critical questions about their governing institutions. And so that may not seem sexy, but if you don't know what quality looks like, you don't know what to ask for. And so this is one of those tools that Josh is talking about, that they're just like they're creating tools. We're beginning to think about the importance of creating these tools for the long term so that people know what to ask for and what to demand.
Is it possible for someone or a group to be 100% wrong?
I'm going to just say no. It's not possible. And I'm hoping that the root of your question comes down to something that I've just like a core value for me. I've never in my life met another human who is always wrong. And even if they're wrong in their conclusion, they're sometimes right in their intention. And even if they're wrong in their intention, there's sometimes a reason that happened that we can understand. And it is a practice for sure. The people in this room are clearly really good at, but it is a practice to be able to look at someone who has done something to you or your people in an abhorrent way, but still see their humanity. So I'm Jewish. The example we always use is the Holocaust. But now the example that we use is Israel and Palestine. And I'll be the first to say, I don't even pretend to have expertise on that. But what I do know is there are some people that are doing horrific things to other people. And there are some people who are doing it for very misguided reasons. But somewhere in there is a humanity that we can work to uncover and understand, and it allows us to show up in a way that I believe is more productive. I don't want to be Mr. False Hope, right? Like there are people who are rotten eggs, but you can't go around your life thinking everybody's a rotten egg.
I think, even if someone is wrong, in their what they, the beliefs they hold are factually wrong, and the actions that they might take are morally abhorrent, they are doing them for a reason, as Josh is saying. And so I think, stretching ourselves to understand why people are doing that is really important. And I think, as Michael has said, and as Bishop Barber often says too, it's important to have empathy with, many of these white voters who have always lived with the notion that their people are going to run things and they're on top, and they see that slipping, and it freaks them out. And especially freaks them out if, their community is dying, the stores are boarded up, their kids, are having to move away because they can't live there. Like, we have got to understand that, as you said, we may not agree with the intentions or the conclusions, but there's so much pain in this country, right? There's just a whole lot of hurt, of all different kinds. And I think that we do need to approach each other with a certain kind of gentleness sometimes, right? And a willingness to listen and to exercise some of that, some compassion.
And we have some recent examples of where when you get too righteous, you screw yourself. Take the equity movement, social justice movement since George Floyd. We got so righteous that we tore our own organizations apart. You're not black enough. You're not gay enough. Not straight enough. To Nancy's point, you didn't say the right word, so you got to be the devil. I mean, we did all this stuff to ourselves. We're not even capable of fighting our opposition in any way because we tore ourselves apart. We used unionization not as a tool for equal wages or whatever. We used unionization as a way to say, I want to tear the organization apart because I don't want to talk to management, right? I mean, we used the wrong instrument for these types of things. And this had nothing to do with the racist. It had nothing to do with anyone else. We did this stuff to ourselves. And so I don't want to be righteous. I don't want to be in an echo chamber for that reason either. Because you become too arrogant. I even felt this about the equity movement. We started thinking that, when the nation becomes a nation of color, everything is going to be okay. I think that's a really arrogant and almost racist in the reverse type of statement, because what it is signaling is that there's something inherently good about black and brown people that I don't believe is there. Right? We all have to grow into learning to love each other and to live with each other. And you don't get that by virtue just because of the color of your skin. But these are real things that have been dogging our equity movement for the longest. It's one of the reasons why I moved away from racial equity and I talk about the all now. I get the importance of intersectional interest. But you can get so down a rabbit hole of intersectional interest that you can never then bring people back together. So you actually, from a results standpoint, are no better than the racist, right? They're tearing us apart for one reason. You're tearing people apart for another. And so I don't want to be stuck in cement like that. I just want to be humble enough to get up every day to do this work and know that I'm equally as flawed as the very people that we're sitting here talking about, right? And I hope that someone would give me the same grace that I need to give them.
Mm-hmm.
If you had the opportunity to be a dictator for a day and implement policy link, would you go that route or take the slow pace of democracy?
I'm taking a slow pace of democracy.
We don't do dictators. Yeah. Because that's not the goal. The means have to match the goal, right? And the goal is to empower.
Right. But there's this, I guess climate change might be a better example. Is the urgency urgent enough to make a special consideration for something like this, to make quick decisions? Just for a day and then you pass it on.
I'll take the bait on this one. So sure, if I could be dictator for a day and as part of that day extend time infinitely because I have ultimate power and be able to have the conversations and practice and data and learning that's required to create a better governance, would I want to use those godlike powers to give America the power to rewrite our government? Yeah, I'll take that. And now I want to know what your next question is. It's going to put me in a corner for saying so.
Yeah. And the reason why I wouldn't take it is because we're still going to destroy it. It's just like you go out and buy your kid that fancy car and then they tear the clutch out of it, like I did. And my brother, and all, it's, you don't respect it.
Yeah.
You're going to destroy it again. Right. And so to me, I would so love to. But I know the things that we're talking about empowerment, if the people don't own it and don't respect it, they're going to destroy it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to have my day of glory, maybe even several years of glory. But I have done nothing to create generations who will cherish what that act was about. And that is the fundamental problem.
That is an awesome answer. That's such a good answer.
The people that come behind that noble act are going to shit on it.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And we'll be right back here.
Yeah.
So if we got to be destroyed by climate change so that we learn our lessons, so be it. That seems to be the only thing that we can do now is sometimes learn from really deep destruction. So if that's the only way, I'll take that.
What we're talking about is obviously we need structural democracy reform. We need change in policy and practice. But what's got to drive that is a cultural change, as Josh was just saying, but also a kind of, and I say this, I'm not, a person who attends any particular house of faith or anything, but I think we need a kind of spiritual regeneration, a real change in values, as we've been talking about. And well, there's an economist who talks about this in simple terms, but he's like, there's two ways to approach things. Yo-yo, you're on your own, or wit, we're in this together, and so we've talked about over these few days, trying to move, and this is part of the climate and everything else, but we've got to get away from this looking at things as a zero-sum game, right? And that if Josh somehow gets something, I'm losing, or if Michael advances, I start kvetching. And instead, we've got to realize that we're all going to flourish together or we're all going to go down together. It's just so simple, right?
Who's resisting you?
Let me just start with my own movement. I think our own movement sometimes resists itself because we don't necessarily really believe the shit that we're saying. And so it's one thing to get on a stage or on a podcast and really talk this talk. But sometimes when you look in people's eyes and it's time to take the action, they really don't believe it. So sometimes I find the resistance in our own movement, let me call it work avoidance. We avoid the work by arguing about definitions and things like that. So there's a level of resistance there. What I find around folks who mean me harm, they don't really get in our way. They're not going to come in our office there. And if they do, they'll get dealt with. Right. But so I find the biggest resistance from us is that we talk in a language that my mother doesn't even understand. Mm-hmm. So it's not even resistance, but I can't even sell this shit to my own group of people. Housing as a human right sounds good. I ain't selling that shit to black and brown people on the south side of Chicago. They're going to be like, what about my equity? And so we have a lot of provocative words that we use, and I get the vision of it, but we've not built the bridge to those things. We talk about down with capitalism, but when I say to my staff, well, shit, rap music isn't ode to capitalism. What are you talking about? You know what I mean? So it sounds good on stage, but you can't even sell it to your own people. So I'm less worried about opposition as opposed to really finding the real practically revolutionary shit that I can actually sell to my mother. Because right now, the shit that a lot of us as progressives are selling, we don't even really want it. Right? Like if you ask most progressives, okay, you want housing as a human right, how much of your equity are you going to give up? Or what's the plan to bridge from an equity state to something else? We don't have that. The innovations for us is to be in that gray area and figuring out what is the bridge to get our people there. And so the resistance to me is less about folks who want a radically different America. And it's more about on any given day, we only have 13 to 18% of the nation that's with us. And we haven't learned how to expand that in practical ways to other groups of people that we could easily attract.
My work has been a lot about, as Roosevelt would say, malevolent corporate actors. Yeah. And there are some out there. Mm-hmm. So, I have looked at groups and interests like the fossil fuel sector's most aggressive ideologue, Charles Koch, who has funded most of the climate science denial at this point in America, more than Exxon, but has also, led in creating an entire infrastructure of hundreds of organizations that are engaged in trying to rig our politics, in trying to capture our courts, in trying to transform any outpost that they didn't control. So bases in higher education, really sophisticated weaponization of trustees against college presidents and students and faculty. I mean, I could go on. And I'm not the only one who researches this. There's great, like Center for Media and Democracy, True North. There's lots of people who cover the day-to-day on an ongoing way. But so I do think that they are out there and really inflicting significant harm. But I think there's also been a confusion on our side that we haven't really reckoned with. And this kind of connects to Michael's part about, getting ourselves clear. Like, there are a lot of critiques to be made, and I am certainly one who would make them, about the way capitalism operates now in this country and in our world, right? I mean, we talked about climate change, but also, there's just so many things. What's happening to workers? The billionaires. There's like good people who say every billionaire is a policy failure. You can make honest multi-millions from being an entrepreneur with a great idea, but when you start getting to billions, usually you're rigging the markets, right? And so, I am perfectly willing to acknowledge that there are good things about capitalism. And right here, we're sitting here with headphones and a great sound system, and all of these other things that are brought to us from, markets that are functioning. And so I think that we need to just, say that, like, yeah, markets have done some real good. Now let's unrig the markets so that we don't have these tech giants driving other people out, these blah, blah, blah. We could all go on. But so I think that's part of it too, because I think part of our challenge in this is going to be to divide that coalition that exists now on the other side. And just on the question of climate change, tourism, agriculture, insurance, there are whole sectors that are being so undermined by climate change, let alone their workers. And I think we have to be able to reach out to people in those sectors. And we can't do it if we're just saying, all corporations stink, capitalism is bad. We've got to distinguish between types of capitalism and types of capitalists. And some have done really, really good things and really important things. And some are doing, again, Roosevelt malevolent things that need to be addressed.
So to the prompt of who's standing against us, I think the question is, what are we trying to build and how are we trying to do it? Who's in the way? I agree. We're our own worst enemy at times. And I think that on many issues, Nancy, you've talked about a lot of the different actors that are in the way of progress on those other issues. For me, with Represent Us, it's been a hard thing to do, but we are solely focused on building a political system, which includes culture, but building a political system that is actually responsive to and accountable to we the people. So it's ours. There's a dynamic there. And putting that system in place, I want to be abundantly clear that the people often standing in the way of that are the ones that benefit from the system as it currently stands. Those with power want to keep it. When we work in a blue state, the Democrats push back first. When we work in a red state, the Republicans push back first. And that's not false equivalence or false bipartisanship. That's the political reality of the battles that we face. We've hired consultants to work for us in a state only for them to call us a week later and say, sorry, we're going to have to cancel your contract because taking this contract would put me out of business for the rest of my career. That's code for the political operation behind them said, if you ever want to work in this town again, you won't work for these people. And so we're up against a sophisticated machine. Yeah. Just when you look at politics, you don't even have to get into, climate is a whole other thing. But I want to be clear that in order to win, we have to get past the partisan barriers and become we the people to make a government that is responsive to us.
In some ways when I'm listening, I gave the answer that I gave because until we think differently and build different organizations, even if we're concerned about the resistance that is so true that Nancy is talking about, we can't even offer up a response that is formidable.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But in many ways, the structure of our work is a big barrier too. When I'm frustrated, I was frustrated once, and a colleague that I was working with says, Michael, Rosa Parks never predicated her work on getting a grant. And I was so angry, but that was so true. There's a way in which we operate that offers its own resistance to what we have to do. Mm-hmm. And some of this is getting above and beyond the organizational constraints that we are in to do this work. And so I just offer that because the types of change that we're talking about, it will probably take out most of our organizations. My board has talked about it. We're going to get sued. And my board is comfortable getting sued. I'm renting this job. It's going to last so long. And then the question is, what will I do then? Right? And so there are real questions. It's why I don't carry debt, because I'm not going to be in this job forever. And so I don't need to try to plan a lifestyle around it. Right? Mm-hmm. And so these are really important things that we need to talk about, because we're talking about revolutionary acts, and most revolutionaries don't have jobs like we have. And we need to these are things I want my movement, the equity movement, to start thinking about, because when you're talking constantly about something else, you're never preparing yourself for the ultimate thing. Mm-hmm. I'm prepared for the ultimate losses that are going to come my way for the agenda that we're advancing. Mm-hmm. My wife is prepared for those losses that are coming our way. And I think it's really time for us to get comfortable with that and stop romanticizing this work and stop fantasizing that it's going to be doing anything. I'll give you a practical example. I don't know many organizations that I could go work for if I left PolicyLink. That's tragic, because we would be fighting every day. Can we do real equity work? Can we do real people work? I said it the other day, I don't have to have a board meeting to talk about serving people. Most orgs that I would want to go to, they'd be like, well, I don't know if we can do that, Michael. We got to see if the board wants to do that, right? If that's where you're at organizationally, you've already lost.
Yeah.
You can talk about the Koch brothers all day long if you want, but you're not even ready to take them on, because they'll go to the wall.
Yeah, they will.
And we won't. And so I raise this for the listeners to really begin to think about, are we really prepared to go to the wall for what Nancy keeps reminding us we are up against? It is formidable. Josh is reminding us at the state level, we're up against formidable shit. Mm-hmm. And we've never really asked ourselves, are we really structuring ourselves and prepared to win and to suffer the losses that will come along the way?
That is beautiful, Michael, and it's so true. I just would like to add a piece to that, too, because I think this might be interesting for some folks who would be listening to this Hatch podcast who might be in the foundation world. I've been asked by a number of groups. Basically, they've put me before their funders, right? And some funders have invited me in to talk to their boards about this, because really foundations, the way they're operating now, many of them feel like they're doing really good work, but they're not. They're really hindering the kind of work that Michael is talking about needing to be done. And the complaints that I've heard, which totally makes sense to me, are first of all, self-regarding foundations. They want to make a big impact here, right? But they want to be able to measure that impact, and they want to have that impact, say, within 3 years, right? So what that does to the groups that they're funding, and they want you to do it, differently from these other people, et cetera. The people we're not funding, you got to do better than them, right? So the incentives are aligned in all the wrong way. On our side, right? So short-term grants, measurable results, which often mean local victories, which can now be preempted by states, as is happening in, many places in what I call behind the red curtain. But so local victories, not investing long-term in visionary leadership, right? Like saying to somebody like Michael, okay, you've really thought this through. You have a vision. You have an impressive team. You know what? We're going to bet on you, because this is the generational work that we need to do. So we're not going to make you nickel and dime, right, for some little grant here that you can patch together with one from there and there and make you tell us, what are your metrics on all these things you've done in between. We're going to say, this is work that needs to be done. And also, let's not put you in competition with people, but instead give you tools that let you bring the field together, right? And so there was actually, I had to miss it because I was coming here, but there was a conference in San Francisco on fixing philanthropy. And that was part of it. And the other part is so many foundations now treat the 5% IRS rate, payout rate, right, on the endowments as a ceiling. It's not a ceiling. It's a floor. Right? So there's something called the crisis charitable commitment to make foundations step up and say, we had, the crisis over racial injustice and policing on top of the pandemic, on top of the financial crisis, which never went away for so many communities, on top of the crisis of democracy. What in the hell are we doing giving only 5% of these riches? Actually, what we're engaged in, if we do that, is resource hoarding, right? And we need to be instead pushing that, if we believe in the goals we state, push out much more, right? Wind down these budgets. And so, at least commit to spending 10% a year. So again, there's so many different dimensions to the challenges we face, but I think people in the philanthropic world have a real role to play in having hard conversations with their colleagues.
What are some questions that aren't being asked?
Just because our institutions have endured in the past, why is it that you think that they will endure forever? This is a big challenge we face. Masha Gessen, the brilliant person from Russia and writer about the Putin regime, was asked by an American audience, what do you think Americans can learn from your research in your writing on Russia? And she said, oh, that's easy. Never assume the worst can't happen. So I think we need to realize that the world is changing and things we always thought that we could count on, we can't count on anymore. We've got to fill the breach.
That resonates a lot. John Gardner told us that if we didn't have the capacity to self-renew, that our institutions would just become inert. And we've not really asked ourselves, what does it look like for our institutions to regularly renew, to be in a state of renewal? In a state of renewal because they're asking themselves, what needs to be accomplished today? Right, when we asked ourselves that question at PolicyLink, it meant that our entire portfolio had to go out the window. Because what we discovered was that, to Nancy's point around philanthropy, we were A+ students for program officers and absolutely irrelevant in the results-based world of the equity movement. That's a hard-ass pill to swallow when you're still doing really good work. But it was the stone cold truth. We were cancerously dying by doing good programmatic work for program officers. But we were fundamentally missing the moment. And the moment was if program officers said, would you be doing this shit if it wasn't for a restricted grant, or would you be doing something else? The answer was always, we'd be doing a lot of other things. And that's that cancer, right? That you can still be really good, getting lots of money, and so irrelevant. And this happens a lot in our spaces about our own institutions. And I'll give you one of the most practical examples. It just drives me crazy. I won't say the name because I don't try to talk about institutions that are in my space, but I'll say the name and you'll know who it is. How the hell did we get through a place where we knew affirmative action was temporary? And none of us can tell you what the alternative to affirmative action would be now, but we're doing fucking sign-on letters about how awful it is that we lost it. That is malpractice. That is malpractice when your sole job was to have a legal response. But this is the state of our institutions today, and yet we have the audacity to get mad about what someone else is doing to us. We're not ready for the fight, and this is a perfect example. I'm in the fucking equity space, and I can't tell you what the alternative, if there is even one, is to affirmative action. And it's been under assault for the last 20 plus years. It's not like this is a new assault. This is just the culmination of a long fought fight. And so too many of us, I would say, too many of my own folks who are leaders like me, were too comfortable being at Martha's Vineyard, the Essence Fest, and the fucking NAACP Image Awards versus doing our fucking jobs. And this is true, folks. That's not the work. It's not the fucking work. And we're running around like peacocks strutting across stages and shit. And we can't even then look at a body of work and stand on it in the moment of crisis and say, I'm going to hold the line. And this is to Nancy's point. We've already lost our institutions. We're just not willing to say it. We're not willing to say it publicly. We've already lost them. They're not serving people. They're not coming up with leading edge responses to the crises that we face every day. And so we're in a fucking dream state right now. And that's why I just gave you this one simple example. Your sole purpose was to have a response to this shit that you helped us achieve. Thurgood Marshall and so many others be rolling over in their fucking graves right now. And it's this apathetic level of leadership where we take these jobs, we get seduced by what they offer us, like coming to Hatch. We get really good salaries, and then we don't fucking deliver. So this is why at PolicyLink, we centered the 100 million, because I need to be judged by what indicators am I really moving in the world? Not how many conferences I get to go and have a good 3 to 4 or 5 days at, or how many publications I write. And if we don't get this point, we will never, ever win, because what it's signaling is we aren't even intellectually curious enough to be creating the things that we should be putting out in the world. And I'm just talking about Black folks now because that's what I know. So I'm talking about that shit. And so when I look at the next generation of leaders, I see a huge crisis because of my colleagues are ready to become life coaches instead of taking these jobs because they're too hard. I think that's a cowardly way out. You see my point? So while we're talking about what white folks are doing, hell, at least they're running their organizations and they're ready to kick our ass. And we're talking about, I need rest. The NAP ministry ain't for revolutionaries. It's just not. And so when I think about what's not been asked, it is, are we really as leaders getting serious about why are we taking these positions? And are we really prepared to do the work at hand? It is hard. It is laborious. It is draining. And I might have a heart attack doing this fucking job. And I have agreed to all of that. And if the day that I don't want to accept those terms is the day I should get out of this damn seat.
Wow. I had a friend at another something I was at. We were having a conversation about burnout, leadership. Mm-hmm. How hard are you willing to push and for how long? And somebody said, it's a marathon, not a sprint. Mm-hmm. And somebody else said, no, it's a fucking relay race. Mm-hmm. So as soon as you can't carry that baton, you hand it to someone else and you appreciate that you did your part in the race. Mm-hmm. And I think it's such an important thing for developing leaders because this work is hard. Mm-hmm. And to know that it is actually not your responsibility to take the role and keep it for your whole entire life. It is your responsibility to push as long as you can and find other people to train and help and bring along with you and give them the baton and kick them in the ass and say, go.
That's right.
As a future ancestor, what's a message that you would leave for future generations regarding democracy?
Somebody else is going to say this if I don't. There is truth to the idea that democracy is messy, that it's the best of a whole bunch of systems that are not great. But when it's gone, we will miss it. I ended my talk yesterday with a quote from the president of Germany in 1920. If you think about time-wise when 1920 was, this is important. He said, without democracy, there is no freedom. And the translation of that is that you don't have freedom if somebody else is making the choices for you all the time. With democracy, it's the only way you are truly free to make choices about your future and your family and your environment and your kids and your body. And so that's what I would hope to leave behind.
And I would say that this democracy has to be rooted in love. You know, that the operating system, this hierarchy of human value, which is our operating system, it can't be allowed to exist. And if I'm talking to someone in the future, that you must keep it deeply buried away. It can't come back. And the way you do that is that this democracy is rooted in love of all people.
I think of the great African-American historian and citizen John Hope Franklin, who said in 1944, after he was denied the right to serve his country in World War II at the level, of his talents, still burning with rage, understandably, from that. But he said that democracy is an act of faith. And he went on and spent the rest of his long and glorious life enriching democracy in many ways. And I think it speaks to the marathon, but also, again, going back to being a historian and a historian of social movements, it is a relay race, and we stand on the shoulders of all the people who came before us, the people who made this a country, who bequeathed us a republic and a democracy, of the abolitionists who said, we can't, I could go on movement by movement. I won't. But the point is we have amazing ancestors, whose shoulders we stand on and who are sources of faith and counsel and who weathered really difficult times and personal struggles that we can learn from. But we need to give future generations the understanding that they are part of a beautiful, proud lineage. And they have a responsibility to carry that into the future and to improve it and to see the things that we missed.
That's right. I'm Tate Chamberlain. This is the Hatch Podcast. Nancy, Michael, Josh, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be with you, Tate.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Tate.
Empathy requires experience. The psychological pain and illness, breathless romantic heartbreak, bullying's hot rage, shame, the gutted hollowness of loss. These visceral benchmarks unite us in suffering, and it's impossible to empathize with what we do not know. In this, perhaps the most tragic element of our personal, cultural, and universal shared stories. We can't avoid those violent, bigoted, divisive political and social pitfalls, despite our recognizing them as such throughout history, because we haven't felt them personally. We can't be advocates until we know, truly know, what we're advocating for and why it's important. McAfee rightly acknowledges that the United States, as it teeters economically and politically, is ushering millions of mostly white, middle-class citizens from a reasonable standard of living, a quality of life that holds space for family, opportunity, growth, education, retirement, into the seemingly bottomless pit of working poverty. In this imperiled space, those mostly white, formerly middle-class citizens are rubbing shoulders with their marginalized and maligned, mostly brown brothers and sisters, many of whom have been slaving, sometimes quite literally, to eke out an existence in that pit for hundreds of years, preserving with fortitude in the face of both hatred and apathy. As an increasingly number of people in the United States come to know that pit, they can finally see the endemic inequity that props up the success of a few on the backs of the many. In this, the many have the clearest path against the few since this country's inception. They have union, and that is, in the darkest of comedies, hopeful. Whether this hard-won awareness engenders a united front, one defined by every color, denomination, orientation, gender, and age, against the shared dictators of our demise, or creates further dissension amongst and betwixt until we all fall down, is indeed the stuff of stories we tell our children with pride or waking nightmares from which we never fully arise. Evolution or ashes.
It seems now more than ever that we have found ourselves on the cusp of monumental worldwide change. Whether we consider the environment, politics, infrastructure, health, economics, or inequities across a broad swath of social constructs, the consensus is clear and urgent. All is not as it should be. The United Nations, a consortium of 193 member states from around the globe, agrees. In 2015, the UN unanimously adopted the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. These goals call for urgent action and global partnership to secure peace and prosperity for people and the planet, now and into the future.
In alignment with the SDGs, Hatch, a curated network of artists, activists, and entrepreneurs working together to accelerate positive global change, has partnered with I Am Interchange to fuse adventure journalism with experiential design labs to develop innovative solutions to complex global challenges. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the podcast. If you enjoy it, please subscribe or leave us a rating. This episode was produced by Yara Craner, Susan Karstensen, and me, Tate Chamberlain. A shout out to our media and production team, Jessica Byerly, Darko Sevilla, Jacob Desch, Sean Mackinson, Amin Yarsu, and Zane Giordano. A special thanks to Yara Craner, Jared Silverman, Kirk Euclid, Roshi Gavechi, Eitan Shapira, Pete Strom, Reem Haddad, Cole Jansen, Tom Silverman, Raymond Ansodagi, Mark Gerner, Adam Taylor, Erica Mackey, Elke Govertson, Anya Bulis, Bradley Honeyquill, and the rest of the Hatch team and crew from Arcosanti. Thank you for hosting me. With so much gratitude to the Hatch supporters, Steelcase, the Kauffman Foundation, the Gwydion Fund, Envision Equality, the Hatch volunteers, board of directors, Hatch guardians, and the community who help make this work and mission possible. To learn more about Hatch, visit hatchexperience.org. Building community could not happen without food. And with that, I'd like to thank Whistle Pig Korean, Red Tractor Pizza, and Zocalo Coffee House. Do you have an issue that's riddled by gridlock in your community? Shoot me an email at tate@iaminterchange.org. That's tate@iaminterchange.org. Remember, share airtime and don't ruin dinner.